Welcome back to the show. Many thanks for staying with us. Now, former Chief Executive Officer of the GNPC, Tsatsu Tsikata, has been observing 10 years after his incarceration. He was acquitted and discharged, by the way, in 2016 of the same crime. He is my special guest today, and he's been walking me through his days in and out of prison and has shared his thoughts as well on a few national developments. Let's start with his days, his trial, his days in and out of prison.
As I entitled that article, and as the theme shows, my sense is an overflow of praise. Overflow of praise to God about all that I went through in that period. Because I don't look back on it with any sense of hurt or bitterness or anything like that, but rather, you know, in a profound way, as a time of a spiritual high for me. My wife and I say that quite often, that we
what
does
spiritual high mean?
A spiritual high in the sense that in that time, one felt the presence of God very strongly. Okay. And his guiding and his leading in a situation which was difficult to comprehend. I mean, I went to court one morning not expecting that the judge was going to give a judgment. She had given no notice of it. I had a daily devotion with my wife in which we read a nice passage from Genesis, the Garden of Eden. The judge had asked for me to come very early to court, 8 a.m., but I had no clue that I was going to end up that day at Nsawam prison. But that's where I ended. And yet, when I think back on it, you know, I can smile at it because in that period, I had a strong sense of God's empowering of, you know, me, and in my complete weakness. I mean, he was there, you know. So that's how I look at it fundamentally. And that's why all my reflections about that experience have been in that light, in that spiritual light. In the first year after I wrote an article, God meant it for good. And 5 years on, his mercies never fail. His mercies never fail. We'll get into his mercies. So now it's the overflow of praise. So I'm full of praise to him. At this moment. At this moment, about that whole experience. And the psalm that, you know, I think it disappeared in the Daily Graphic edition, but the psalm that I concluded and from which the overflow of praise comes is Psalm 63. And if you'll allow me to read it, because there is a translation, the Passion Translation, which I've become very fond of. And there are particular verses in that translation which, from verse 5 in Psalm 63, I overflow with praise when I come before you. For the anointing of your presence satisfies me like nothing else. You are such a rich banquet of pleasure to my soul. I lie awake each night thinking of you and reflecting on how you help me like a father. I sing through the night under your splendor shadow, offering up to you my songs of delight and joy. With passion, I pursue and cling to you. Because I feel your grip on my life, I keep my soul close to your heart. So I overflow with praise.
Have you always been this spiritual?
Yes, I have.
Or did you have to take this prison sentence to make you that spiritual?
It wasn't the prison. You know, in an interesting way, even the prison experience had more or less been anticipated in my mind from the time I was in university, when Mr. William Oforiatta used to come to the University Christian Fellowship. I was a member of the University Christian Fellowship from when I entered university in October '66. I'd been in Scripture Union at Infantsperim as well. But when Pa Willie would come to speak at the University Christian Fellowship, he would talk about his prison experience. Okay. Because he'd been in prison many times, including a time when I became his lawyer in the 70s.
Right.
And so he would talk about that in a very joyful manner, literally. And for me, when I look back, it was almost as if he had prepared my mind for a time when I would be in a similar situation as he was in. And as he talked about before, I really, so in the time when I was in Soham, I would just imagine Pa Willie also in that context,
about his experience.
you know, because he'd been talking about it to us at the University Christian Fellowship, and he developed a fondness for me at that age. I was very young when I went to university.
I read somewhere you were about the second.
I was 16 when I went to Legon.
You were about the second person to have finished school, university at 18?
Yes,
right.
Yes. So Pa Willie would finish his talk, you know, at the University Christian Fellowship, and often he would walk with me to my room in Legon Hall.
With some more prison stories?
With stories about his life and everything.
Okay.
And my roommate then was his nephew, Duke Dankwa, you know, a son of J.B. Dankwa.
Okay.
So he would come to my room and also, you know, chat with Duke and myself. And I actually remember that there was a time when a film was showing, 10 Commandments. And Pa Willie insisted that we should go and watch it. And he gave us money to go to Orion and watch 10 Commandments at the time. And we did. So we didn't use his money and not go. But when I look back, I think that relationship with him was also a very good preparation for that short experience that I had. He had it multiple times. In fact, he would tell the stories about the difference between the experience during the colonial period and then during Achampong's period and during Nkrumah's period and all that. And he used to tell interesting stories about that.
Interesting. Let's speak about, and I want to find out how your experience was. You've spoken about the garden feeling you had, but I'm sure it wasn't all garden all the way for the couple of months that you were in there. But let's talk about what got you in there in the first place. GNPC, you were tried on for causing financial losses to the state. Now, you led the GNPC to guarantee a loan, and that loan was for a private company. Now, when they defaulted, the GNPC had to pay. Didn't you think of this? Didn't you think of the consequences?
Of course I did. Of course I did. And as you know, that conviction, by the way, has been quashed by the appeal court. So that conviction does not stand. And the fact of the matter is that that whole transaction arose out of GNPC appointing Merchant Bank, a subsidiary of Merchant Bank, were trustees of our funds. And we were investing those funds through Merchant Bank in various opportunities that they brought to us. And one of them was this cocoa opportunity. That opportunity was backed by the IFC, the International Finance Corporation of the World Bank. It was backed by Agence Française de Développement, the French bank, because it involved, you know, developing a species of, you know, cocoa, which Cocoa Board had been experimenting with, and which was going to increase, you know, the production of cocoa in Ghana. At a time when we're talking in a period when cocoa production in Ghana had plunged to the depths and was beginning to pick up again. So that is the context that you have to bear in mind. So with the advisors that we had, professional asset management, you know, company, Merchant Bank, Merban Investment Holdings, I think was the name of the subsidiary. We acted on that advice in making the decisions that we made. And all those facts were before the court, but the court really didn't take account of all of that. In the end, however, the court's decision, thank God, was overturned in November 2016, and I was acquitted and discharged on all those counts. Okay.
So you went the extreme of making sure that you were properly acquitted and discharged. So when the Free Tsatsu movement I mean, at the time that the president, Kufuor, granted you, granted you presidential pardon, you rejected it, but you still went out of jail. Why didn't you just stay?
No. I rejected it. I would have nothing to do with a pardon, because the president at the time knew that I had already started an appeal. I appealed the day I was convicted. I did an appeal right away. No, the appeal was succeeded. That's what I'm telling you. The appeal ultimately was heard by the Court of Appeal and was successful. So everything, I was acquitted and discharged. And what I'm saying is that while the appeal was pending, the president knew that I was seeking to have the matter determined judicially. And so as I wrote in my letter to him, that pardon was really in bad faith, because he knew that I was trying to pursue my legal rights, and I wasn't interested in his pardon because, frankly, he had a lot to do with my being in jail in the first place and my being convicted, because it was obvious in the circumstances, the political influences that came to bear on that situation that I was in.
But do you have evidence to that effect?
Yes, I do, but we're not going to get into that. I do have evidence about what I'm talking about, and what I'm saying is that yes, I do have evidence about that. And
so
that is the reason why on that day the Attorney General had not been in court for 2 years, and suddenly on that day, on a day where the court hadn't sat for about 18 months, the judge had been deferring hearing the case until the Supreme Court decided on an aspect to do with whether the IFC would be compelled to come and testify or not. We're waiting for that. It was going to be the following week. And the Attorney General suddenly appears at 8 a.m. in court with his whole team of 5. They had already got the police to be ready, the prison officers to be ready. I was the only stranger in Jerusalem because I didn't know that there was going to be a judgment. I'd gone in very early with my good friend Mate Newman beside me. I actually drove him to court that day, and I had to hand over my keys to him at the end of the day. But I really don't want to dwell on those circumstances because they don't matter to me in the overall scheme of things. God meant it for good, as I said, because...
That is when you're looking at it from a purely spiritual perspective. But when you're also looking...
Even in human terms.
When you're also looking, then and you've said several times that you don't want what happened to you to happen to someone else.
That's true.
Exactly the reason why we need to look at it and determine what really went wrong so somebody else doesn't suffer your fate, as you put it. So why would the executive at the time want you in jail?
Well, I'm sure, as you understand the politics of this country, my association with President Rawlings, who I had defended also in 79 and thereafter had worked with in various ways, was a problem for people on the other side of the political divide. And I know that. We really don't need to get into all that in detail, but that made me a target, quite frankly. It made me a target, and the case against me and the kind of, path through which I was arraigned before 4 different courts in 2001, and the case gets thrown out as it was in the High Court, and as you know, the Supreme Court also declared the fast-track courts illegal. Then 2 new judges were appointed to increase the number of the Supreme Courts, and then a review panel was set up, which then overturned by a new majority a decision that the Supreme Court had given. I mean, the manipulativeness throughout the whole process of my trial, the manipulativeness of the judiciary, I mean, is stark, and everybody talks about it.
But why don't you want to talk about?
Well, no.
Why don't you want to talk about the evidence that you have?
What I'm saying to you, I started giving you an account of the evidence.
The circumstances.
Yes, and the evidence from those circumstances, as I said, is that the executive was, one, already aware that a judgment was going to be given that day. And so they had made arrangements for police presence. I have actually been directly told, but I can't name the people, of the fact that the police, for instance, were called in advance and were made aware of the fact that I was going to go to jail that day. And that is why by the time the judgment was read, and by the time a crowd began to gather around when news of this decision came, the police were in full force with armored tanks and everything at the precincts of the court. So I insist that I don't want to go into detail about that because it really doesn't matter to me. It's not something about which I agonize or I have any hurt or bitterness or anything like it. It's not. As a matter of the historical record, we can discuss it. But in terms of my existence as a person, I give glory to God. Okay. I give glory to God for having taken me through all of that. And that's why I said God meant it for good. And that is not just some sort of spiritual dimension different from my human physical existence, because that dimension is part of my physical existence as well. I give praise to God. And for me in this period,
talking for you, but because there are lots of people out there who are listening to you who want to learn from you, who want to learn from your experience, for example. So you were talking about why you did not take the pardon. You rejected the pardon.
Yes, I rejected the pardon.
But I read a headline that says, Tsatsu rejects Kufuor's pardon, but
he walks out of jail. Well, I didn't actually walk out. I was in hospital then. I was at the cardiothoracic center on admission after I'd had this asthmatic attack in prison. And so what really happened was that after I sent the letter rejecting the pardon, the prison guards were taken away by the executive.
Okay.
The prison guards who were, at my ward in the cardiothoracic, they were taken away. So of course, when I was discharged by the hospital, I wouldn't drive back to Nsawam prison and hand myself in. That wouldn't make sense. Okay. My dear wife drove me home.
Yeah, because by coming home, that was admittedly an acceptance of the pardon, wasn't it?
No, of course not. Of course it wasn't. Of course it wasn't. And incidentally, in the appeal court decision in November 2016, they actually go into the issue of the pardon because they were considering whether the pardon could have an effect on the hearing of the appeal. Because from my hospital ward, that's their decision. But I mean, if I had applied for bail, by the way. Okay. I had applied for bail pending appeal. And that bail had originally been refused by the same justice who heard the case. But eventually, that application for bail succeeded. So, I mean, it's in the end, I was out on bail because the Court of Appeal reversed her decision not to grant me bail. The Court of Appeal reversed that earlier in 2008, I think December 18, 2008, and referred the matter back to a high court. So another high court in January or February 2009 actually granted me bail. So I legally had bail pending appeal. And then in November 2016, I was acquitted and discharged. So I'm completely covered legally, don't worry. I didn't just walk out of jail on a pardon. I rejected the pardon, and I did not rely on the pardon in any way. I applied through the legal process, got bail pending appeal, and then got my appeal heard and I was successful in the appeal.
Between 2008 and 2016, that's quite a period.
Well, unfortunately, the processes take time. In 2010, we went to court for the hearing of the appeal, and at that time, the record of appeal was put before the judges, and the judges determined that the font size was too small and it had to be redone. Unfortunately, it took another 6 years for the font size to be redone and for the new record of appeal to be ready. That was like May 2016, and then in July the appeal was heard.
And all of this time,
I was on bail pending appeal.
What were you doing then? How was your life like for you at the time?
Well, by then, of course, I mean, I had been out of the public sector, so I have been involved in an oil and gas company that I set up with some friends internationally. And so I've been involved in the oil and gas, both in consulting as well as in developing projects. I was involved in the establishment of the National Oil Company of Equatorial Guinea many years ago. And I have maintained a very good relationship with the petroleum sector in Equatorial Guinea, for instance. I've been involved in some projects in other countries in West Africa.
My special guest, Tsatsu Tsikata, there taking me through his days in and out of court and what actually happened that sent him behind bars. But he is quick to insist that that decision has been quashed, and so his conviction no longer stands. In the next part of my conversation with him, he goes ahead to actually talk about the removal of the Electoral Commission boss. I also pick his thoughts on the political strategy of now NPP Chairman Freddie Blay, who was a student in Mr. Tsatsu Tsikata's law class. You've given me the reason why you thought that the decision to lead the GNPC into making that investment, guaranteeing that loan was necessary. When everything went south and your trial was on and everything, did you have a conversation with the people behind this company? It's called Valley Farms.
No, I never did. I mean, the managing director at the time gave evidence for the prosecution, and interestingly enough, his evidence was actually not very favorable to the prosecution's case, because he made it clear that this was a very viable investment, and he made it quite clear that the decision-making process was through Merchant Bank, who were acting as trustees of GNPC. He gave an account of all of that.
So then who was responsible to pay back this money that obviously was owed the state?
Who was responsible? I
mean, who had to, the loss that was made at the time?
There wasn't a loss made. There wasn't a loss made. Let me tell you why there wasn't a loss made.
Okay.
That company had assets which effectively GNPC was supposed to take up in respect of that guarantee facility. They had assets, they had huge land, nobody bothered. In fact, one of the things that was clear in the course of the trial, and which was also disclosed in the evidence of the managing director, was that they did not even bother to go and assess the farm and its value, because if you're talking about causing financial loss, you have to go and assess the value of what is there, what is in effect the security that's available to GNPC. They didn't bother. The police gave evidence that they were supposed to go several times, but in the end they were not allowed to go. I mean, it's obvious that there was really no interest in the facts of whether there was value created for GNPC or not, so that the talk about loss was completely fictional.
So the GNPC got told of the assets of the company?
Well, they should have done. Whether they did or not,
do you know if they
I don't know. I don't know. I don't know what happened afterwards.
Did you try to ask around?
Of course I didn't try to ask around. I was no longer a chief executive. I no longer had a role. I was being prosecuted and persecuted.
So you would have been interested?
No, what I was interested in was showing that the decisions were made properly through a respected financial institution's advice, backed by even the IFC, the International Finance Corporation, an arm of the World Bank. That's why we were seeking to have evidence from the IFC. And it was at that point that the judge said she was waiting to get the decision as to whether the IFC should be compelled to come and testify. The decision of the Supreme Court on that matter pending. The judge had said she was waiting for that. And then out of the blue,
you went to prison.
She says she's giving a judgment. And when I reminded her that day, she said, I rescind my decision.
I read that. I read that like over and over again.
You know, exactly. Those are quite extraordinary circumstances. But, you know, if you take a decision that has the backing of reputable financial institutions, and you are in a position that I was in at that time, I don't think that it's legitimate for it to be criminalized in the way that it was done. But that's what happened. Which
comes back to the issue which you have raised, and which the Free Tsatsu movement also raised, even at the time you were pardoned, that there is extensive
interference,
manipulation, of the judiciary by the executive.
Yes.
Do you still think that exists? Is that the situation at the moment?
I think there are some indications of that, but again, as I insist, in my current reflection on all of that, I don't really want to make an issue of that, because that's not the issue. The issue that gives me the overflow of praise is the fact that you may have powerful forces in the executive, in the judiciary, or whatever, that may see themselves as able to orchestrate whatever they want to orchestrate. But those powerful forces are nothing in the scheme of God's eternity. They are nothing in the scheme of God's own orchestration, because in spite of what they were hoping to achieve, perhaps, I came out of prison on a day when it was a Sunday. They all perhaps did not even have any knowledge of the circumstances that I had gone through overnight. And that asthmatic attack literally led the director of the prison to just let me get out of the prison, let me end up in hospital, at Nsawam Hospital. They didn't have the facilities, unfortunately, to be able to take care of my critical situation. And in the end, it was my wife who had to arrange an ambulance, which came all the way from Koforidua that morning. And then I ended up initially at 37. I had great medical attention there with urgency, then ended up at the intensive care unit of the cardiothoracic center. So in my spirit, those are more important events than the other events that you seem to want me to do alone.
But you have been a part of the judicial system.
No, I've never been a part of the judicial system. I may be a lawyer, but I'm not part of the judicial system.
I mean, you are more a part of the judicial system than I am as a journalist. That's what I mean. But let's just say as a lawyer.
The Chief Justice is responsible for the judicial system.
Okay, so let's just say as a lawyer.
Yes.
As a lawyer, I know that I'm not the only one who is interested to know. As a lawyer who is also has a dint of politics in there, you will know how, and with your experience, you've just made it categorically clear that there is a level of manipulation, that there is an interference of the judiciary by the executive. And now what I want to find out is whether, and you are passionate about this country and the development of this country, the judiciary being an important part of it. Over the years, what do you make of executive manipulation of the judicial system up until where we are now?
Yes, I think that's part of what I would describe as the power syndrome, where, you know, people in executive authority are very eager to have their power reign supreme over everything. in an unchallengeable manner. So from the time of independence, you know, we've had situations where, again, unfortunately, you know, President Nkrumah, judges were sacked when they gave a decision that was not favorable to him, a famous decision, Ria Koto. Judges were removed and new judges were appointed. And, you know, you had similar situations subsequently. Dr. Buzia, you know, when a decision in the Salah case went against him, again, it was not something that he was excited about. No court, you know, the famous thing about no court, you know, came from those periods where, you know, the executive felt that no courts can get in the way of their executive authority. And so that's a syndrome that we really have had. And it's that's why I call it the power syndrome, unfortunately. When people are elected into office within a constitutional system, sometimes they want the framework of the Constitution in terms of the balances between the different arms of government, you know, to be set aside so that their will reigns. And that again, you know, if we look at it biblically, we see how indeed, you know, powerful people, kings and so on, often come to a situation where they, in recent months, have not followed too closely all of that because I've been in and out of the country. But one thing is clear in my mind, which is that the allegations that are being made about, you know, judges who were part of the committee that was set up, suddenly being promoted and so on. I mean, they raise concern. They raise concern not because those judges are not competent or qualified or whatever, but even the appearance that might be given, that they are being sort of rewarded for a job done and so on. Even that appearance does not enhance the credibility of the appointment process, unfortunately. And I mean, I would hope that there would be clear explanations that would be given that would, you know, satisfy Ghanaians that perhaps nothing untoward has happened in relation to that. But, you know, even the appearance, unfortunately, can undermine credibility. And that's why I think it's important for the executive perhaps to go the extra mile in ensuring that, you know, the public is fully cognizant of the basis on which those judges were considered and are being appointed, so that, you know, everybody is clear in their minds and in their hearts that this is really something that has been done properly. I have no question in my mind about the competence, the capabilities of those judges. But, you know, again, when you throw it back to my situation, where the two judges who were, you know, suddenly, you know, Justice Afre was appointed, and the two, together with Justice Lamte, who was added to the panel, those two judges were the ones who then turned the scales to have the review, which, you know, decided the matter against the earlier decision of the Supreme Court. So these impressions do matter, unfortunately.
Okay. What about the removal of the EC boards? People have said that it was a very bad precedent and it was dangerous for our democracy. Do you feel the same way?
Well, again, it depends on what the facts are. One of the things that struck me from an early stage in this process was that there were questions about the identity of who the petitioners for the removal of the EC chairman, who the petitioners really were. Again, I don't know what the ultimate resolution of those issues were, because you know, those were important questions. I mean,
but will
the
it
identity. Well, of course,
will it matter if because she was found to have breached procurement laws, which is the reason the presidency.
Yes, but wait a minute. You know, I think in these things, again, yes, there's been a committee of inquiry. They've reached certain findings and so on, but if it is indeed true that there are issues about even the identity of the petitioners, then the petition itself and the hearing of the petition itself is open to question. Okay. And so, again, those are facts that I'm not privy to, and I don't know how they were handled in the context of this committee that was set up. But I'm saying that they're important issues. Okay. And you know, again, learning from my own experience, and I say this with all respect and not I don't wish to be misunderstood. It is sometimes quite easy for the executive, once they are determined to have a certain cause, to feel that they should push it through at all costs, in the face of even concerns about maybe process, about how this is appreciated by the public at large. But I would say from my little experience, even in my own case, that in the end, it can haunt you, you know, if you take decisions that, on reflection, perhaps may not be in the best interest of the relevant institution or the situation that you're trying to cope with. Okay. So in this particular case, I really do not have enough of the facts. Okay. I have not read the committee's report. I have not really followed the whole process and so on. So I wouldn't be able to make a comment on that. But I'm just saying that in general terms, I think there's always a danger, especially when things get very strongly politicized and you have, you know, people sort of wanting, you know, a certain course of action for a very political reason. Sometimes that can lead down the wrong alley, unfortunately.
Okay. 18 months of the Kufuor-led administration. You are very passionate about this country. You've just told us. What do you make of it so far?
I'm not, again, going to be able, in this time left for us, to give an overview of 18 months of, you know, a government. That's impossible, because I think it would require a lot of important assessments. I think that, you know, this country has gone through very interesting democratic developments in which governments have changed hands from one party to the other, all for the good of this country. And I think we should applaud that. But I think that when you look at the experiences and you look at some of the current situations, we still have many challenges, regardless of political dispensation. The challenge of corruption and the challenge of national resources not being seen as being optimized. You know, those challenges are still very much with us. I mean, I think that it's well acknowledged. The president himself has made certain changes to heads of certain institutions recently for whatever reason, you know, clearly out of a recognition that some of those things are not working. And so we should ask ourselves, why are they not working? And one of my concerns, you know, from I would say early stages of the government, when you had, you know, people, armed people, sometimes going to courts and, you know, wanting, not just wanting, but actually taking people out, and some of those people apparently, you know, feeling very powerful because they are close to centers of power. those are disturbing for any country. And I don't think that those things have been completely, sort of dealt with in the current situation. So there's still clearly those challenges, and that's why I sort of summarize all of this in terms of what I said earlier, that in the scheme of things, every president, every minister should see themselves as an individual human being with certain human capacities that God has endowed him with or her with, and ultimately being stewards of the graces that God has endowed us with, and therefore searching themselves and asking themselves, in this role, am I being properly accountable for what the nation's resources that have been entrusted to me, what they represent for the people of Ghana? Am I being really accountable? And I think that's a kind of self-searching that, frankly, I believe all of us should undertake.
But
not just as political, not just as politically. Well, I believe it can happen, and I'm serious. I believe that if church leaders, leaders in the Islamic tradition, leaders in other religious traditions, if we would take seriously what we say is our faith, and use that to challenge, people in authority as well as ourselves in terms of what we do and how we manage resources at our disposal, I think that we'd be a lot better off than where we are at the moment.
You've been closer to politicians. Do they really have this sense of reflection?
Some do. President Mills, as I used as an example, he constantly had that reflection. He constantly had that reflection. And he for me, sort of represents that kind of incorruptible leadership.
That's one out of...
Well, no, it's an important example because, he, even in that short 3.5 years space, I think he projected something for this country that was incredible. And you saw even at his funeral, the kind of massive national kind of angst about his passing. People from NPP as well as NDC. So as a human being, people came to respect him and that stature. So I think that's what we can all aspire to. And for me, ultimately, and I told you earlier, my passion is about the youth being able to take up that legacy of integrity that President Mills, for instance, kind of symbolized so distinctly. And I believe that as we commemorate later this month, I believe his passing, perhaps that's a thought worth sharing, especially hopefully. Amongst the young millennials.
And speaking of millennials, some of them, and I've spoken to some of them personally, and as a journalist, there are times that I get really frustrated about things that, the way things go in this country, especially now that we are exposed to the outer world and what happens elsewhere. Sometimes when you want to do a lot of comparison, you get very frustrated, you get demoralized, and maybe
you shouldn't be.
Certainly, I shouldn't. I know that, but sometimes it gets difficult. But of course, we keep pushing ahead. But let's get to what extent would you say you are a politician?
I've never regarded myself as a politician.
Never?
Never, because if you like, I got into politics, so to speak, through my involvement in some of the cases that I did representing prisoners under Achampong, in the Achampong regime, when I was representing people like Pawili and Sami Okujeto and so on, appearing as a junior counsel to Joe Reindorf, and that sort of got me more into the limelight of politics. But even then, I was seeing myself more as a lawyer
rather than
a politician. And then, of course, you know, representing Jerry Rawlings, and then in his time in office, my role in various capacities. And all through that, I really never I saw myself more in terms of somebody who, as a patriot, was wanting to contribute whatever talents God has endowed him with to the service of the nation. That's honestly how I may have been very naive about that, but I recognize that I'm seen as a politician. I can't do very much about that. But again, I emphasize that for me, politics should not be about partisanship. And that's really something that is, again, problematic in our current state of affairs. Because it's almost as if, you know, if in this dispensation, if you're not MPP, you're not supposed to have a stake. And that is a problem. It's a problem if it's NDC as well. If NDC is in power and people in NDC feel that they are entitled to everything, people in MPP don't have any right, I reject that.
How can we deal with that problem?
I reject that. And, well, we deal with it, as I said, at the human level, as citizens, having conversations like we're having, recognizing that that is actually not good for us. It's not good for our institutions.
Right.
Our public service should be run as a public service, not as a party service. You know, so these are things that we as citizens, you know, not spectators, have to take on.
I've seen that you Mr. Bagbin, Kwame Nahoy, Freddie Blay, etc. were your students.
Indeed, I'm privileged to have been teaching law in the Faculty of Law when, you know, so many of these people passed through the faculty, and I hope I contributed in a small way.
Are you older than them in any way?
Usually I was about the same age, but that's because I went to university when I was 16 and I graduated at 18. So,
and also because you were desperately, you had a desperate need to be in the same class with your brother.
That's true, that's true, that's true. You know,
your older brother.
My older brother, I used to follow him as a kid when he started class 1, and it was just the two of us then. So I would follow him to school. And I think in the end, my parents had to enroll me as well, you know. And so he, you know, provided a sort of inspiration to his younger brother to take on.
So recently, he just won the NPP chairmanship race, so he's become the substantive chairman. At the time, he was acting, and part of the, you know, campaign. There was this controversial matter about his purchase of some buses for 275 constituencies. It's been a debate that's still ongoing. People think that it was a good political strategy. He did it, he won. People think that this is an avenue for you to create a lot of doubt in the mind of floating voters. I'm wondering what you make of that. He said, well, I've got the resources. I decided to help the party purchase the buses.
You know, frankly speaking, I think that, you know, if he's had resources to help the party, it doesn't help to do it at a time just before a primary or just before an election, because of the perceptions, and that's a reality also. But more than perceptions, as you know, he's actually been accused of vote buying. Yeah. And yes, there is a crime, you know, related to that kind of monetary influence on elections. Whether he's guilty of it or not requires investigation and so on and so forth. So I'm not pronouncing on that. So I'm just saying that, you know, it creates that whole issue. So is he going to be investigated now?
There are calls for him to be investigated. Exactly. He doesn't think it's necessary. Do you think that is necessary?
I mean,
as a lawyer?
Obviously, if there are calls, including calls by some of the people who lost in the election, if there are calls like that, even if those people have in the end conceded and so on, they are serious matters of criminality. So those matters, yes, would have to be investigated.
Okay.
And they would have to be investigated, you know, in terms of a normal criminal investigation. In other words, I mean, vote buying involves using monetary inducements in connection with a forthcoming election.
But his defense is that
let me just finish, because I haven't made a determination of, you know, what, you know, he did. I'm just saying what the criminal issue is about.
Okay.
It is in terms of inducements in connection with an election process. Now, so again, the facts are evident. There was an election process in view. That's evident. The facts are also evident that he, you know, procured, you know, these buses for constituencies and for people who would be involved in the voting process. That's also a fact. Now, the issues perhaps about what was the process that ultimately led to those buses coming. I don't know what the history of the internal discussions about those buses within the, I don't know. So, you know, that's what I'm saying. Those would then be matters to be investigated.
Okay.
If there were to be a criminal investigation, those would have to be the matters to be investigated.
Okay.
But, you know, again, I don't want us to make this too legalistic an issue. It's not just about the legalism of whether Freddie Blay is guilty of the crime or he's not guilty of the crime. What I'm saying is that if I were Freddie Blay, I would also just sit back and just reflect, you know, what impression has been created through my actions, and could that have been avoided? You know, could that have been avoided? Because I may have good intentions, but if I do it in a way that creates all these impressions, in the end, I may actually be doing more harm to my own cause than I would have wished. You know, so that's the perspective in which I would prefer to look at it. And honestly, looking at it in that perspective, I'm sure that Freddie Blay would probably recognize that he could have done it a bit differently.
Well, we won't go any further into that, but I doubt it, because in an interview he granted one of my colleagues, he didn't seem to have any problem at all with his actions. But I'll just end it there. My conversation with my special guest today, Tsatsu Tsikata, there. We'll put some on our website, myjoyonline.com, just so you can have a more detailed, have a look at it in your own good time. But